All right. Well, thank you, friends, for joining us again today. And I want to just begin real quick by reviewing something I highlighted for us last week. And that is that if you go to the church calendar, which you can just go to St. Anne's Episcopal or St. Anne's Damascus.net, up at the top, there's a calendar button, and you can see what our Rector Bible study coverage is. So again, today we are doing Genesis 25 through 50. And then after today, we actually have 2 weeks off. And we will reconvene on January 7th when we begin our journey through Exodus. And we'll read the first 19 chapters in Exodus. So just wanted to highlight that. So today we are working through the second half of Genesis, with the second half of Genesis, and we have come over here. The second half of Genesis, in which we are covering Genesis 26 through 50, and then 250. Perfect. Okay. And then we had a couple of questions that folks were asking just now about some of the material we had covered in last week's session, and happy to just answer those at the outset. So one question, what is the Apocrypha? So when we began to go through this process of determining what scripture was going to be considered part of the canon of the church, there was a lot of prayerful debate and discernment around that. And there were different voices that kind of brought a set of their scripture forward that they had used in a worship context, and different communities that had different scriptures that they used in the course of their liturgical life. And some of those were texts that only existed in, at least as far back as we have them, in the Greek as opposed to the Hebrew. And so fairly early on, this is a very quick and sort of simple explanation. Very early on, there was a determination made that there was going to be a privileging of the Old Testament texts that were written in Hebrew, and then the New Testament texts like the epistles and the gospel traditions that were identified with apostles or with St. Paul. And so you have some additional, for example, New Testament texts, like there's the supposed Gospel of St. Thomas, for example, that didn't make the cut, but then, like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John did. And so when it comes to the Old Testament, the texts that were sort of raised up as being the premier texts for Holy Scripture were those that we had originally in the Hebrew. The apocryphal texts were ones that some communities used in a worshipful context. Some communities, even at the time of Jesus, would have used them in a worshipful context, but they were originally in the Greek. So the books of the Maccabees, Tobit, some other wisdom literature. And so those were kept, but they were kept kind of in a separate category. So even as the Roman Catholic tradition integrates them fully into Scripture, there's this sense that they are part of this additional canon that is not the kind of set, universally agreed upon canon that all the different traditions would affirm. And then what you have happen in the Reformation period in Europe is that many of the reformers decided to eliminate those texts entirely from the Bible. We, as the Anglican tradition, have traditionally kept them, but kept them in a different category. So we use them for kind of devotional purposes, educational purposes, but we don't use them historically in worship. And I'm happy to answer more questions on that as well. There's a great little video I linked in the very first class that kind of shares some more on that.
Did you say, though, that they are used in the daily lectionary?
They are used in daily lectionary, which is true. That is a worshiping context. But interestingly, in the Episcopal Church, and that is a nuance for us, in the Episcopal Church, the daily lectionary has historically been promoted more as a family and personal devotional practice than a core. Even though there is an encouragement towards corporate observance, the kind of heart of the daily office was seen as something that individuals and families would pray. There's an expectation. If you look at the beginning of the prayer book, there's a preamble in the prayer book, and it talks about that all of us as Christians are called to a life of prayer, and that this observance of daily prayer. So there's even though it is worship, it's not the same category of corporate worship as Sunday morning. So yeah. So anyway, and the inclusion of them is in the new prayer book. Whereas if you go back to the office readings in the 28 prayer book and before, they weren't included. So a distinction there. Okay. So today we are looking at chapters 25 through 50. And Tim, I mentioned I am just a bit behind this morning, so my Father John notes and fun facts will be included when this comes out on Friday. But what we have today are just kind of the more kind of educational notes here. So an answer, a question I received from someone who watched the video and wanted a follow-up. I just wanted to take an opportunity to recognize them in their question. They were unclear from last week's class about the names used for these 5 books that we're beginning with, the 5 books that start the Old Testament, and how ancient those different names are. So Torah, which is law or instruction in the Hebrew, is a very, very ancient term going back at least to the post-exilic period. So that would have been the Babylonian exile. So we're looking at about at least the 7th century BC, so the 600s BC. We know that collection of works was being called Torah by that point. Now, how much earlier than that was it being called Torah? We don't know, but that's a very, very ancient term. As the Roman Empire developed and spread, and even the Greek Empire before it, Greek and eventually Latin become the lingua franca, the language of the empire, and for Jewish people living in diaspora. And interestingly, just a quick aside, that term diaspora, today we talk about it in any context. So you hear people talk about the Irish diaspora or the French diaspora. Diaspora originally specifically referred to Jews who did not live in the Holy Land. So that the first community that was described as being in diaspora were Jews who did not live in Israel, in Judah, in the kingdoms, in what we would call today the Holy Land, or the Levant. And so that community, as they spread around, as merchants, as other people living in other places, they began to speak the language of the empire. And in this case, it was Greek. And so they even had their own version of the Hebrew scriptures that was translated into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint. And I mentioned that just in a note last week, but I don't think I actually explained the Septuagint, you also see it listed as LXX because the tradition is that 70 scholars were brought together, 70 rabbinical scholars, to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek for these Greek-speaking Jews who did not live in the region of the Holy Land. And by tradition, it is understood that when all 70 came together, the translations matched precisely. Every single word, every single element, there was no variation in any of the transcriptions. And so it is believed, the tradition is that text then becomes equally valid as a scriptural authority as the scripture in Hebrew. And just as a distinction there, you may know that for the Quran to authentically be the Quran, it has to be in Arabic. It cannot be the Quran in English. It cannot be the Quran in another language. Now, you will find versions of the Quran that are translated, but as the true, authentic, without error book, it can only be in Arabic. And see, that's where there's a difference here. There was this belief, this was a divinely guided and inspired work by these 70 scholars. Therefore, it is just as valid. And that's so the term Septuagint, sept, comes from 70. It's the 70 who translated, but the Septuagint is the Greek version of Hebrew scriptures. And in the Septuagint, depending on the community that you are a part of, these 5 books would be referred to as the Nomos, which is Greek for law or custom, or the Pentateuchos, which is the 5 books, because it's the 5 first books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Those 2 terms, Nomos and Pentateuchos, would have been used also at the time of Jesus. So they would not, it would probably have been more common for Jesus to hear the term Torah because he was in a Hebrew and Aramaic speaking context. Aramaic is a Semitic language. It's very similar to Hebrew. It's not quite. There are a few variations, but there's more similarity between them than differences. And they both have the same root in the Semitic languages, like Arabic, for example, is also a Semitic language. And so it would have been the case that in both Hebrew and Aramaic, the term most likely used would have been Torah. But then, there were Greek-speaking Jews in Jesus's orbit. We see this in the whole of the New Testament scripture. He's interacting with these diasporic Jews on a number of occasions. And so he very well would have, very likely would have known the terms Nomos and Pentateuchos as well. So that was just a question someone asked. And I just wanted to clarify that. So moving into this week's narrative. Okay. This narrative this week may feel a lot more scattered and seemingly disjointed than the chapters we read last week. Part of this may be related to the weaving together of the various source material from which the whole of Genesis is drawn. And Chris, I don't know if you had an opportunity to watch the video from last week, but one of the things just to remind us is that it's very clear from the scholarship that there are different voices, different authors that are present in the book of Genesis, and that over time, those voices and authors were edited together into one cohesive written text. I am compelled by the suggestion or argument that these earliest sources were oral traditions that were knit together into a written text. And there were two primary sources in Genesis: the Yahwehist text and the Elohist, or the Yahwehist author and the Elohist author, and that's the distinguished by how they refer to God. So the Yahwehist author refers to God as Yahweh. The Elohist author refers to God as Elohim. And then there's a later voice that is referred to often as the priestly source that is sort of editing J and E together into a more cohesive whole. And then there's additional evidence or indicators that there are some editorial choices made that are not the priestly source, that there was some other editing done as well. Okay, so on that point, just to kind of look at the chapters, and this, you might sort of see this as you read through and you feel things are a little bit disjointed. Chapters 26, 27, 29, 32, 33, 38, 39, and then 42 through 45 are almost exclusively the J source. And then chapters 31, 40, 41, and 48 are almost exclusively the Elohist source, the E source. And then chapters 28, 30, 34 through 37, 46, 47, 49, and 50 are all a mixture of them, where there's a heavier amount of editing going on. And so what you notice is that very rarely do you have two chapters that are cohesively one author. So it's kind of jumping back and forth between voices. And that can create this sort of feeling of choppiness, as you read through it.
I didn't have time to go back.
Yeah.
But it was kind of disconcerting. Like some things seem to be repeated.
Yes.
Almost identically.
Yep.
And then other things were like, what is happening?
Yes.
Here?
Yes.
I don't know. I felt that in this section.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So that certainly is the case. Something else that I'll talk about in a minute is how themes begin to play a really prominent role, so that you have multiple generations kind of re-experiencing the same events, because that kind of event becomes archetypal and becomes thematic for the journey of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So we will talk more about that too. A potentially good example of this second element. And so I said, the source material piece. And then the other thing that may also relate to the difficulty is this transitioning of an oral tradition into a written text. And a potentially good example of this oral dynamic is the repeated use Vatahar in chapter 29. So Leah, Vatahar, again and again she conceives. And it's this constant repetition. And if you ever listen to an oral story, or especially oral stories that are communicated through some kind of cadence, like a song or a poetic form, it's very common to use the same language repetitiously, because it's a way of kind of helping to remember, and we think about that even in our popular music today. Lines are repeated. That's how we encounter that form of communication. And so when we read it in a written form, our eyes can start to glaze over, because you just see the same words over and over and over again. But to me, that's an indication that we are encountering what was an oral tradition now being communicated in a written text. And so you have this kind of awkwardness in experiencing it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then this is really the heart of today's points that I wanted to make, this point 3. And I think this goes down through. But what we really, really begin to see in this second half of Genesis are what I will refer to as these baseline themes that become hallmarks of patriarchal and matriarchal behaviors and personalities throughout the Old Testament. And so from now through the minor prophets and at the very end of the Old Testament period, we're going to see a lot of these themes repeated consistently over and over again. And many of them can sometimes be awkward themes for us to encounter. And I just want to say at the outset that there's not a kind of easy resolution to this. It's something that we kind of have to sit with in its ambiguity. And I will tell you that. That is my position and my kind of perspective on it. There are other Christian denominations, other preachers, teachers, other scholars even, who really try to create some kind of framework for explaining this. And I'll give you an example in the very first issue that I address. But I mean, my kind of approach is that there are times where our relationship with God is complicated and ambiguous. It's messy. And sometimes we just need to let that be what it is. That sometimes these complexities are unresolved and we live with them because we live in relationship to a living God, where things aren't always very neat and settled and clear. So the very first example is this issue of craftiness, which I note sort of craftiness, for lack of a better term, that develops into a regular hallmark of patriarchal behavior, especially, but we even see it with some of the matriarchs as we get further into the Old Testament. Sometimes it is a craftiness in language play. And I give you the example that we talked about last week with Abraham and Sarah, where they legitimately were half siblings. And so where they were in this context where they wanted to obfuscate their spousal relationship, they weren't lying when they said we're brother and sister, but they weren't giving the whole truth, right? They were being somewhat obtuse about the fullness of who they were. But then in today's section, we have this example of Isaac and Rebekah who just outright lied. They are not siblings in any sense, and yet they still present themselves as siblings. And this, to your point, Chris, here is another example where you have basically the exact same story repeated from one generation to another. There is a whole approach in life. There are psychotherapists that use this in a therapeutic context, but also church, like pastors and others who use this concept of family systems. And one of the ideas behind family systems is that practices, repeated behaviors are communicated generationally. That you have the same problems that exist over and over again generationally, and you have the same, often the same gifts, the same talents. But this is I think family systems people love these passages because they're like, see, this is just this is from generation after generation they're doing the same thing. But so you have this kind of craftiness with how Isaac and Rebekah navigate that being in this sort of inhospitable environment. Then you have Jacob outright lying about his identity as Esau in order to receive the birthright. And this is an example, just to sort of give some concreteness to my statement a second ago. I have encountered other pastors and some scholars who say, well, that's okay because Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. So yes, this was kind of devious, but Esau had already given it over, so it's okay. Jacob's not doing anything wrong here. To me, it's still really underhanded, right? So like it's an unresolved complication, right? Like he's being messy here. And it's a messy story. Even as he's held up as one of the major patriarchs of the Old Testament. There's some real ambiguity to his righteousness from our perspective today, and I think we sit with that as a tension. Um, and then we have Rachel hiding her father's idols from him. In the story of Laban chasing after the yeah yeah.
And
So
what was that all about?
right. Yeah. No, it's a very complicated story. And then we have other behaviors, and these were just kind of a couple of examples, but that seem unavoidably immoral to our modern engagement with the text. But it's also not clearly delineated or defined in Scripture itself. It's one of these many sort of unresolved complexities of the text that we as a people have sat with and wrestled with throughout the ages. And again, I just want to say, to me personally, I have found that our Jewish brothers and sisters often do a much better job of just being honest about the reality of that kind of complexity. That they sort of are willing to go to the to go to this place of saying, God, what are you doing here? This doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem just. These people don't seem to be behaving properly. And to just kind of name that for what it is. All right, secondly, hospitality continues to play a very significant role in proper and right relationship. You may remember the comment I made last week about the key to the Sodom and Gomorrah story being this lack of hospitality. And we see repeated occurrences in the second half of Genesis of hospitality playing a very important role. Um, Hospitality playing a very key and important role in the narrative. And examples of this include Laban's embrace of Jacob when Jacob goes to Padam Aram, Jacob and Esau's reunion, and also the challenges of being inhospitable, like the troubling story of Dinah and her brother's reaction. And that again, very terrible story there, right? And then some real kind of complexity to what we understand to be going on. And then we find again and again the repeated theme of the juxtaposition between barrenness and fertility, and God blessing women by opening their wombs on account of their righteousness. The whole story of Rachel and Leah, at least to me, is a strange one to our modern ears, as God seems to constantly be going back and forth between blessing one and then the other. It's almost as if he's caught in the midst of their spat. And one of them says, now you're not treating me fairly this time. So he like does something for her, like let's say Rachel. And then Leah says, but what about me? So God like turns around and does it. So it's like this constant back and forth between the two of them and God in this like complicated triangulation. And it's just a weird text. It's a weird situation. And I think we have to just kind of see that for what it is. But throughout Scripture, even beyond the context of that specific example, which is just sort of strange, we have this overarching theme of barrenness and fertility. And that extends even into the New Testament. So you may remember that Zechariah and Elizabeth were of advanced age when she conceived John, the cousin of Jesus, John the Baptist. And she was blessed with a child after years of barrenness. This is a theme that continues on throughout Scripture, and we will find it many times over again. And then finally, inasmuch as there is this ambiguous role of craftiness and character flawedness in some of the patriarchs and matriarchs, we also have the extended story of Joseph. And Chris, it was just a note. You made the observation last week, which I think is so accurate, that these stories that seem so significant and important to us in the Genesis context, these major stories of creation and the early life of humanity are, in point of fact, quite short.
Yes.
And then we have almost the whole last quarter of Genesis being just the story of Joseph.
Right.
So
I wonder they could do a play about it.
Yeah. So we have again this kind of interesting journey of some things being really short and some things being really long and drawn out. But the point I want to make with Joseph is, by all accounts, he was completely blameless and righteous. There was almost nothing he did in his life that was underhanded or crafty in the ways that some of the other patriarchs are being displayed. And so you have this juxtaposition of those who are kind of crafty and underhanded, and those who seem very pure and blameless. Now, that being said, many scholars have suggested that Joseph was probably a little bit of a goody two shoes, because he has this dream even before Egypt. He has this dream where he comes to his brothers, and he's the little brother, right? He's the young one. He's not the youngest because he has Benjamin behind him. But coming to all these older brothers saying, well, guess what? I had this dream that all of you are going to be subservient to me, And maybe he was being completely earnest about it, but if you have younger siblings, you can imagine how irritating that must be.
Also, earlier, it says that he gave a bad report of his brothers to his father. Sounds like, I'm telling Dad
right,
what you guys
exactly.
did. So it's
exactly.
that might have been a little annoying.
Yes. But nothing in his story indicates any of that kind of deceitfulness or craftiness that we have with some of the other patriarchs, and yet they're all sort of on this level playing field of God's blessing of them and God's sort of caring for them. So it's a weird journey for us to take, because we prioritize or we elevate character purity in our modern culture. When we look at people in leadership, we want them to be completely faultless, to be completely blameless. And yet we have this kind of complexity to the righteousness of these many patriarchs and matriarchs in the Old Testament. And I think that just should give us some pause in terms of reflecting on our own faith journeys, but also the way that we encounter and interact with the other, whoever that other may be. So
they're all loved by God.
They're all loved by God. They're all loved by God. And it's also, I think this is a good example of the real problem that some modern interpretations of our Christian journeys have. There are some traditions that say, if you are completely righteous, God will always bless you. God will always take care of you. You don't have to worry about health or sickness or poverty or any kind of thing. And over and over again in the Old Testament, we'll find sometimes terrible people are constantly rewarded with material wealth and goodness. And sometimes the best and most righteous people suffer years of oppression and difficulties and trials. And there's not a clear line to be drawn between our own human behaviors and what God is doing in our lives. And so, it's not so straightforward as all of that. And I think that's just something from the very beginning we see. So again, brief outline of Genesis 26 through 50. We'll run through this real fast. So chapter 26, we find Isaac, Rebekah, and their sibling story in Gerar, and Esau's marriage to the Hittite women. In 27, Isaac blesses Jacob, Esau reacts, and Jacob escapes. Chapter 28, Isaac blesses Jacob, Esau marries his cousin Mahalath. Jacob has the dream of the ladder. 29, Jacob marries Laban's daughters. Chapter 30, Jacob and his children prosper in Padam Aram, the land of Laban. And 31, they flee Laban's household. Rebekah commits a deceit, the hiding of those idols. Jacob and Laban make a covenant. Jacob and Esau meet. Jacob wrestles in the night, becoming Israel, being renamed. That's another theme I didn't address above, but becomes a major, major theme throughout the Old Testament. We even see it with Abraham, this changing of the name. I mentioned it last week, and we'll see that continually as a repeated pattern. Chapter 33, Jacob and Esau reconcile more fully, and Jacob's family travels on to Shechem. 34, the rape of Dinah and her brother's revenge. 35, Jacob returns to Bethel, the death of Rachel and the death of Isaac, which I want to note, we talked a little bit last week about continuity things, and you look at how long Jacob was in Laban's household. We're talking at least 14 years, if not 21 years. It's a little bit, because he's there for the 7, and then he gets married to Leah. Then he's there for another 7 in order to get Rachel. And then there's a little bit of ambiguity. It's probably that he's there for an additional 7 before they leave. But how we count all of that, it's at least 14 to 20, 21 years. And yet Isaac is on his deathbed when Jacob receives the blessing, and he doesn't die until Jacob has returned from this extended period of time in Padam Aram. So, there's not a direct contradiction like we had last week with Ishmael being 14 in one instance and then being carried in his mother's bosom in another and being placed under a bush. That seems clearly not to work in the timeline. This is less so the case, but it still is sort of strange because of how.
I'm glad I didn't spend time going back and trying to figure it out.
Right. Yep. Right. So again, this may be part of multiple oral traditions being brought together, that we have one tradition in which Jacob receives the blessing on Isaac's deathbed and it causes this rift with Esau. Another tradition where Jacob has gone off to a faraway land, and when he returns, his father dies. So, we may just have multiple traditions that are being knit together here. And then in chapter 36, we have Esau's genealogy and the genealogy of Edom. 37, the beginning of the Joseph story, the initial dream and being sold into slavery. 38, this sort of sidebar about Judah and Judah's redemption, at least alluded to towards the end of the chapter. And then this duplicity that is visited upon him. And more stories of twins. Twins become a big thing too in the Old Testament. We'll see this in a few other instances. And so you have, Esau and Jacob being twins. You have the sons of Judah being twins. And then chapter 39, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, Joseph being imprisoned. 40, the dreams of the 2 other prisoners. 41, Pharaoh's dream and Joseph's interpretation, which leads to Joseph's release from prison, his increase in power in Pharaoh's household. 42, Jacob's sons going to Egypt, Jacob's other sons going to Egypt a first time without Benjamin. 43, Jacob's sons going a second time with Benjamin. and then Joseph detaining Benjamin, Judah kind of redeeming himself by pleading his case, the case of the family, and then Joseph revealing himself in 45, Jacob and the whole family decamping to Egypt and settling in Goshen. 47, Joseph presenting the family to Pharaoh as the famine worsens. 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons in a way similar to his own blessing. So we see, again, repeated themes where Jacob intentionally blesses the younger instead of the older. He, the one who is the younger and received the birthright blessing, does the same for Joseph's son. So, again, we're seeing these repeated patterns that occur over and over again. And then Jacob blesses his other sons with all of these different kind of qualities and sort of foreshadowing the roles that their tribes will play. And then he dies. And then in 50, Joseph forgives his brothers, and he himself dies in the land of Egypt. And that brings us to the conclusion of Genesis. So I want to spend just a few moments kind of talking through a couple of elements, and then I'd love to hear what struck you in the readings. But there's a lot of complexity to what we hear in the second half, and a lot of it relates to some of these complicated familial dynamics. And I want to just show a little bit of what this looks like. Let me go here first. So back in Genesis chapter 10, I kind of skirted over this last week. There is a extended genealogy from Noah that is sometimes referred to as the Table of Nations, because it is this explanation of, after the flood, we have Noah and his sons, and this is how we get all of the peoples of the land. And so if we look here, we have the sons of Noah, and then the various traditions, the various communities that come off. If we jump over to, let me see, it's Terah. That's Shem. I thought I had one. It may be this one here. Let me see if I can zoom out on this. There we go. So this actually shows, it's the same material, but it shows you, and I'm going to, actually, let me do it with a cursor so you all online can see it too. So if you look at Shem, I'm just going to show this down to where Abraham eventually comes in. You have Shem, all of Shem's sons. You have Arphaxad, and then from Arphaxad you have Selah, Eber, Peleg, and then Peleg is the great grandfather of the great grandfather of Terah. Let's see. Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. Yep. So great-great-grandfather of Terah, who is the father of Abraham. So Abraham descends back to Noah through Shem. But then if you look at some of the others, like if you look at Ham, you have all of these other groups that begin to pop up in scripture. So we hear, for example, today that Esau marries Hittite women. Hittites were descended, according to the Genesis genealogy, from Ham. And then you have other groups that will come up at various points too. And you have so you have the Hittites mentioned. If we go specifically to Shem, you have an Ishmaelite woman. So this is the line of Ishmael that Esau also eventually marries. And so one of the things that you will find becoming kind of a theme that develops from here on out is these sort of increasingly insular circles. So the Table of Nations, going back to Genesis chapter 10, everyone outside of Shem's line, and especially everyone outside of Peleg's line, honestly, but even everyone outside of Shem's line are not really considered relatives anymore. They are just the people of the earth, right? So even though we go back to this progenitor of Noah, they are no longer seen as being significantly related. So it's problematic for Esau to marry these Hittite women. They are of a totally different people. They're off doing their own thing. They are a totally different culture. They're a totally foreign presence to us. And then eventually you get to where there are other occurrences later on where you have interactions with the Moabites or the Ammonites, and these were the descendants of Lot. And remember, we talked last week about that story of Lot's daughter sleeping with him to continue the family line, and this kind of derogatory, they're the backwards inbred cousins, right. But they become, as the lines continue, also foreigners. Also foreigners. Like, they become outside the circle. So as time goes on, the circle gets tighter and tighter. And then at this point, we have Esau marrying an Ishmaelite because he sees Jacob being sent to Laban. And he says, oh, my father prioritizes people that are within our own line. So he's seeking an Abrahamic connection because he's married these Hittite women who come from Ham. They're too far. So I'm going to move back to somewhere closer to try to ingratiate myself to my father. So I'm going to go and marry my cousin through Ishmael. And so you have him trying to re-enter the circle of acceptability. See, so that's where you have that beginning to sort of take more concrete form. And then you have with Terah, this is more of an extended breakdown of Terah. This is where Isaac goes to Padam Aram in order to where Jacob goes to Padam Aram in order to live with his uncle Laban and to marry his cousins Leah and Rachel. And so you see Isaac kind of drawing the circle, Isaac and Rebekah drawing the circle within their lineage of Terah's descendants. And that's where you have Esau sort of falling outside with the Hittite women, but then coming back into the fold by marrying an Ishmaelite woman from the line of Ishmael. So you begin to see that kind of drawn in different ways.
And so the Hebrews that were reading this in the beginning would get all this. They would understand this because they understood the genealogy.
Right, exactly. And long story short, going back at least to the post-exilic period, which again, that's 7th century BC going forward in time, there was a sense of familialness with the Abrahamic descent. So everything outside of the Abrahamic descent were just the peoples of the earth who we're not really connected to anymore. They are foreigners. They are aliens to us. They are not our people. But the people down to the present day, there's this sense that the people of Abrahamic descent are our people. And so that there is, I mean, for all of the tension, for all of the violence, for all of the conflict, there is, at a fundamental level, a recognition both between Jews and Muslims that they share a common ancestor in Abraham.
Don't they think the Ishmaelites became the Arabs?
Correct. Correct. And that's even the Quran. The Quran talks about Ishmael sort of being the progenitor of the Arab tribes. The Quranic story is that Abraham took a leave of absence from Sarah and his household to visit Hagar and Ishmael after they had been cast out. And he sets them up in a house. And the house he sets them up in is the Kaaba in Mecca, the big square edifice that you see when people go on Hajj, when Muslims go to make their pilgrimage to Mecca. It's the thing that they are moving around. It's this huge black
square, so it's the big black cube thing.
Yep. And it has this huge curtain around it. The tradition is that was a house that Adam built, and that Abraham set Ishmael and Hagar up in so that they could have a place of residence. So
they're I was thinking of it in my mind. It's like you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Like Ham is sort of like the ancestor of other people in that region, like the Middle East.
Yes.
And then Japheth is sort of everybody else.
Yeah.
That's correct. I kind of think of it that way.
I am always hesitant to be too specific about it because the text is not specific.
Yeah.
But if you go back, and you can even Google Table of Nations, and there are images that people throughout the history of the tradition have set down, like there are 20th century maps from the early 20th century where especially colonizers, English and American, where they've sat down and they've taken a huge map of the world and they've said, these are the people of Ham, these are the people of Shem, these are the people, and they've actually identified cultures with the sons of Noah.
Really?
Yes. I don't give that much credence, but there are,
I know that's the tradition, and also there's the Ham. I mean, it was foretold that they were going to be like the slaves of the sons of Shem, and it kind of it later on when we're hearing about them, the sons of Shem like moving back into Canaan. It's like these people, the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites. These are the ones that you can, you're going to drive out. So it foretells that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But there is the sort of key part that I would note in that is that there becomes in our tradition and the tradition of the Old Testament as we have received it, this demarcation of the family of Terah, but more specifically the family of Abraham, the progenitors of Abraham being the true people of faith. And then everyone who comes before in this extended genealogy, they are really kind of beyond the pale. They're outside of the fold. They are foreigners. And then I was going to show you all, friends, just an example, because there's so much, there are so many geographic references in the text we have today to help us understand it a little bit better. So the inset here is the land of Canaan. So the land of Canaan is everything that is west of the Jordan River. So it's between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. It is what is today the modern day state of Israel and the Palestinian territories. And so a lot of the places we hear about, this is the land from which Abraham left Ur. Ur of the Chaldeans would have been here in historic Babylon. This is kind of southern Iraq today. And they would have journeyed across into the land of Canaan. And then you see all of the place names that we encounter. Bethlehem, Salem, where Melchizedek blessed the bread and the wine. We hear about Shechem today, Sukkoth, Penuel. This is the stream where Jacob has the dream, or not the dream, where he wrestles with God at the Jabbok near Penuel. We have the Oaks of Mamre. This is where Abraham was camping when the angels visited him. The sort of guess as to where Sodom and Gomorrah might have been, and then the different places that we hear talked about today. So this is the land in which Jacob and Esau were living with Isaac, and then Jacob leaves to go to Padam Aram to live with his uncle Laban. This would be modern day kind of eastern Lebanon into western Iraq. So this is the sort of Lebanese coast right here. Lebanon is actually a very kind of compact country. So I don't know exactly where Haran is. I'd have to look on a modern map. But this is Aleppo and Damascus. And so, sort of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon all sort of converge up in this general vicinity. And so Padam Aram would kind of cross over between Syria, Iraq there, probably too far east to be part of modern day Lebanon. Now that I'm seeing where Aleppo is. But he was up here in this area, very fertile, kind of grassy plains, very, very conducive to farming and agriculture. And then he comes back down to the land of Canaan with his family later on. So I want to just kind of give that to you all as a sense of sort of the geography of the place. Just as a kind of indication of what we're talking about, to go from biblical Shechem up around, this is the sea. I don't know if you all can see this, but I'm circling my cursor. This is the Sea of Galilee up here in the north, just south of Dan. To go from there to Jerusalem or Salem, walking would be several days, maybe 5 or 6 days walking. And so if you imagine, that's a week's worth of walking to go from there to Jerusalem. Imagine the distance, you must travel to go from Padam Aram down. So, I mean, it was quite a significant distance to travel. The other thing and this goes back to a note that I made last week, to remember about the early narrative of who the people Israel were, the Israelites were. If you remember, I gave the example of the Egyptian hieroglyph, and the language that the hieroglyph used was that these are the nomadic peoples who worship Yahweh. It seems very clear from the text that these were not a settled people, that they were a nomadic tribe. And that is an interesting play that will come up again and again in Scripture, this dichotomy between the settled peoples and the peoples who are nomadic. There is this back and forth. You see in Esau the kind of tradition of the hunter who's always on the move. In Jacob, you see the one who is settled, who stays at home with his mother. And even though there is an ongoing nomadicism to his life. There are these times of sort of settled, extended sojourning in one place for a period of time. And that just thematically kind of plays back and forth. I think the indication is that the people of Israel were not unified in that some lived more settled lives and some were nomadic, and that it's very likely that we have the retelling of the stories of the patriarchs in ways that kind of communicate that there's a both andness to the Israelite experience. This experience of being a settled people and an experience of being a people who are nomadic, who are constantly traveling and moving from one place to the next. That there may have been parts of the larger tribe of Israel who lived on both sides of that dichotomy.
But by the time that Jesus was born, weren't they more settled?
Yes. But there could have been some communities that still remained more nomadic. Very likely, I mean, the indication is that they were more settled. But there might have still been some amount of nomadicism. However, throughout the next several books in the Torah, we're going to find this repeated theme of settlement and movement, settlement and movement, settlement and movement.
So Esau was the farmer, right? And Jacob was the shepherd.
Esau was the hunter. He was a hunter. Remember the story of Isaac being on his deathbed, and he is sent out to hunt the wild game. And Jacob takes his farmed animals, who are not wild game, his what's that called? Domesticated animals, and Rebecca cooks the domesticated animals in the flavors of wild game to trick Isaac. So Esau was the hunter, Jacob was the farmer, the settled domestic person. You go back all the way to the story of Cain and Abel. Cain was a hunter, Abel was the farmer. And Abel's gift of produce was honored by God more than Cain's killing of the wild beasts. So you have this tension between the settled and the nomadic, the one who stays and cultivates and the one who's constantly moving. That's a repeated theme that we will encounter.
So about Esau, I have a question about the whole section on the genealogy of Esau.
Yes.
Since they become, I mean, they're separate from Jacob. Now we're focusing more on Jacob's line. So why is there like the genealogy of Esau becomes Edom? Like, why is that emphasized?
Great question. So there's a separate image. Okay. So this is the nations of Genesis 10 geographically. So the purple are the people of Ham, the pink are the peoples of Shem, and the green are the peoples of Japheth. And that's just kind of limited to the specific Middle East. So the purplish kind of crescent is where the Ham line is developed, and then the people of Shem who become the Terah, eventually Abram, who comes into the land of Canaan. That's where they're sort of setting out this conflict.
That's not where Israel is now.
I know, but remember, so Abraham and Terah come from the land of Ur. So Shem's line is further east, but God calls Abraham out of Ur into the land that he has promised, which is Ham's land, the land of Canaan. And so there's an inherent
a desert and it's
so
a lot greener over there.
Yep, the land of Mesopotamia between the two rivers is quite fertile and quite green. And this land, the northern part of that is the Paddan Aram, where later Jacob would be with his uncle Laban. This land down here is quite arid. And it's going into this section down here at the bottom will be the Arabian Peninsula. So you're really getting into the very dry desert there. But Abram is being called out of his land, the land of Ur of the Chaldees of Shem, to enter into and settle into the land of Canaan, which is the historic land of Ham. So I bring that up, Gail, to then move back to this image. In the section that we read last week, when they get to the Jordan River, that is where this separation between Abram and Lot, they kind of separate their communities. And then you have eventually Jacob and Esau who are born. Esau's line eventually settles over here on the east side of the Jordan River. That's where the Ammonites and the Moabites develop. To this day, the capital of Jordan is Ammon, the same root as Ammon, as in Ammonite. So the capital of Jordan has this linguistic reference point back to the people of the Ammonites. And so I think my speculation is the reason that you have this discourse about them is that they are the immediate next door neighbors, right? They are the people that you're going to have some conflict with, some problems with, but they're also they're familial. They're familial in a way that the Canaanites are not.
Okay. So I was trying to remember where I know they mentioned the Edomites again, and I can't remember exactly what. But I remember that they're not like the Canaanites are the ones you're going to drive them out, but the Edomites and the Moabites are a little bit different. I mean, Moses marries a Moabite when I think Naomi and but I'm just trying to remember that story. Like she's actually she is a Moabite, actually. So they're kind of like they're different from us, but they're not different from us.
They are the distant cousins, the cousins who are a little bit backwards, but they're still part of the family. Whereas the line of Shem is sort of saying they are aliens, they are foreigners. All right. Other questions, other comments for today?
Why is this so important to know the different families and how they're all related? I don't get the reason why this is so.
How do we know who to pay? What lineages are most important to? I don't know, worry about, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. So those are excellent questions. So let me give you my 2 cents worth on that. From right here, I hope you can see my cursor, from the coast to the Jordan River. That is maybe a distance of 45 miles, 50 miles. You could drive from the coast to the Jordan River in a matter of a couple of hours. North to south, as it were, you're talking maybe 4.5 hours. So it's a very small geographic landscape. It is a very compact geographic landscape. Tribal identity becomes very important in these contexts. and the proximity to one another becomes really important. I have family in the Ozarks for whom being a second cousin means that I'm too far removed. But if I were a first cousin, or if I were an uncle or an aunt, then I'm in the fold. Like, there are things that we'll tell first cousins or uncles and aunts that we won't share with our second cousins, our third, that there are these concentric circles where you are inside or outside depending on your proximity. And that still matters to this day. I think I mentioned last week, this is another one that I think is really, this is a really concrete example on Navajo Nation. And Navajo Nation is actually one of the most Episcopal geographic areas in the entire country. That goes back to how the tribal lands were developed, separated off by different groups in the 1900s or in the 1800s in the 19th century. But there are Navajo who live on Navajo Nation who live right next to each other, but are of different clans, different familial lineages, and they have different layers, different levels of relationship with each other, depending on their clan identity. So I don't know if any of you have any familial experience or examples of that kind of thing, but there are many places, even in our own country, but certainly throughout the world today, where your specific identity matters. Who you are, where your family come from matters in a way that I think is very foreign, especially in our kind of cosmopolitan context here, where we are, Germantown, Gaithersburg, Clarksburg are like 3 of the top 10 most diverse communities in the entire country. And so I think we have a much more open sense of what relationship, deep and intimate relationship can look like. Whereas there are many places in the country and certainly in the world today where if you don't have the right surname, if you don't have the right tribal identity, even if you live right next door to me, you don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
You're removed. You're a foreigner.
My mother came from Italy, and that's definitely the case there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the difference between the people that live in the South and in the North,
yep,
and the attitudes toward each other, it's just apparent.
Yeah.
From all the stories I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost it in this country because people mix,
right,
and intermarry.
Yeah.
So it's a foreign concept.
Right. Certainly so. But I think when you look at the geography and you understand how tight and compact it is, there's this real emphasis on your specific identity and your specific lineage.
Did it have to do with maybe, okay, your family, so I'm going to go to war for you and I'm going to feed you versus you're not family and I don't have to worry about you?
Yeah. I think there's certainly some of that, Pam, and especially when you think about how important hospitality is in the culture. All of us, I think, understand that there's a limitation to our hospitality. Like, you can only be so hospitable to so many people. And so if you begin to kind of have a sense of, okay, there's a certain level of expectation for me, Laban, you are my nephew, Jacob, you are very close to me. I'm going to welcome you into my household. I'm going to let you live here. I'm going to let you work here. But you, Canaanite, who are a 7th cousin going back to Ham, you're not even family anymore. right? Like you have to have some delineation there because of how important support and hospitality is. That's speculation on my part, but I think there's something to that.
So most of this concern and with making sure you have sons in this patriarchal society of ancient times is all about making sure you had a descendant to pass your land and holdings to.
Right.
Right. And that's the other idea that there's a limited amount of arable land in this part of the world. And that's why we have have had conflict for centuries, I guess, because you simply can't move too far away from the rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, the Mediterranean Sea, all these, Canaan especially. It's all air. There's really no living in the desert as easily, and so people fight over the most livable parts of the Middle East or this area around the Eastern Mediterranean, I guess.
Right. Yep. No, that's right. The aridableness, the fruitfulness of the land is a significant theme, and we will see that developed more and more significantly as we move into the Old Testament.
A lot of it had to do with like keeping the faith, like their faith. I mean, you have some cases where maybe you could marry a foreign woman, like Joseph married two Egyptians, and it worked out okay. But then later on, you have these men marrying like these foreign women who worship different gods, and they pull their husbands over to worship their God, so they have to say, well, you can't do this anymore.
Right.
But then you've got this, it was Esther, right? She was a Moabite, but then she converted. I mean, she, took all the religion of her mother-in-law and went back, and she was Jesus's great grandmother.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, sometimes it was okay to marry a foreigner, but other times it wasn't. It was a question of keeping that faith.
I think it's both of those things simultaneously, because what you often see is that when faithfulness has waned, when God is intervening because of faithfulness, when he is punishing because of faithlessness, what gets cut off is access to fruitfulness, access to the land that is allowing you to prosper. And so land plays a significant role in this sense of who we are, how we are remaining righteous. If we remain righteous, God provides land. And as I mentioned earlier in today's session, we have to be careful about some of that too, because it's not always consistent. Sometimes people are incredibly righteous, like Job, and just gets the snot kicked out of him over and over again. But as a sort of general principle, what gets impacted is the ownership or the access to the land of abundance when you have fallen aside, when you have violated God's precepts. We see that with the exile or the Exodus, when they violate God's commandments and they are sent wandering in the desert for 40 years. They're cut off from the fruitful land in which they are being promised. And then you see it later on in the Babylonian exile, when they are removed from the land of fruitfulness and sent into captivity in Babylon. So you often see that interplay of righteousness or violation of righteousness correlate to stability in the land of abundance. So, all right, any other questions for today?
I'm just
trying to as we read through, understand the notion of what I would call a polygamy, where you have this idea that there are if that you can have a son by a servant of your wife, and then as long as that woman is the maid, or that's one term I thought I remember seeing for
Mhm.
these women associated with Sarah, for example.
Right.
And so I'm trying to, is this the, was it that when did that, I'm trying to understand how common that is, and if that notion, if this notion of polygamy has always been, there had to be some connection between additional wives and the wives you men had first,
Mm.
or did it eventually develop into you could have multiple wives and they had no real relation to each other? I was just,
Yeah,
go ahead.
my sense of that, there's actually a really excellent work by Margaret Farley. I can look it up and I'll make sure it's in the notes when we post them on Friday. She's a Roman Catholic nun who's an ethicist, and she writes, her big thing is human sexuality. And she has a book called Just Love, Just, Just Love. And she basically goes through and documents what constitutes biblical sexuality. Because so often there's this discourse in society around what is appropriately biblical in terms of sexuality. And she is very clear that there's not a settled uh, position in at least the Old Testament. I mean, her conclusion is by the New Testament, with the teachings of Jesus included. There are some real standards, that mutual respect, mutual love, non-violent, non-coercive relationships are the primary. But you don't see that in the Old Testament. One thing to note is that women, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large throughout the Old Testament text, are property, and they are treated as such. And so most often, marriage covenants, marriage relationships are shaped around their transactional outcomes. What does this do as a property transfer between one man to another, and how does that impact us? There is not a clear lineage throughout the Old Testament of, firstborn children of the first wife are always privileged, or secondborn children of, whatever. So, for example, you have the story that we encountered today of Jacob first marrying Leah, first producing children through Leah, but it seems clear that the child of privilege, the child of greatest blessing, is the second youngest child, Joseph, who is a much later child of the second wife, Rachel. So it's just there's not a coherent position throughout Scripture of there being one particular formula of marriage and progeny that is the preferred child, the preferred descendant. It's kind of all over the place.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just have one. I can't remember which chapter it was in. I thought it was really near the end, where they constantly, within the same sentence, refer to Jacob as Jacob, mm-hmm. and then as Israel.
Yep. And that's a great point. I was going to talk about that and kind of ran out of time, but yeah, it's very interesting that you have that. Again, I think I don't know. I've not ever delved into the specifics around that and trying to understand it. but it is a difference in the way in which the scripture is written from, say, Abraham and Sarah. And you also have in the New Testament, Paul and Saul. The moment that Saul becomes Paul, he is always Paul from then on. With Abram, when Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah, they are never again referenced as Abram and Sarai. They are now only Abraham and Sarah. Jacob is Israel, but then he's also Jacob. It just kind of jumps back and forth. And there's some real ambiguity there. It is very interesting. And I don't know why that is. So
it was confusing at first.
Yes.
But it was, I mean, within the chapter,
yep.
It was over and over and over
yep.
again.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Other questions? Well, thank you, friends, for joining again today. And like I said, we will be off for 2 weeks now, but I will see you all on the 7th of January. All right?
Okay.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Dave's trying to talk to you.
Father John, the postman left a package up there by the glass door.
Thank you. I'll go read it. All right, thanks.